So welcome everyone to the Kent County Medical Society Fireside Chat number 2. This is actually a follow-up to our previous discussion, which was about a month ago, I think, where we're discussing race and medicine. And our 3 guests are returning from last session. And if you want to watch that program, we can send you a link to it. And I'd recommend to get the backstory for our 3 participants today. The doctors Peter Knoester, Nedd, and Herman Sullivan. They're all physicians here in the West Michigan area, and all with unique stories. And so that I think it behoove you to go take a listen to it and see what their backstory. Again, thanks for everyone for attending. Our next session will be actually next week on Monday at October 26th. So make sure you're RSVP for that. You'll be getting some email announcements soon. And that we're going to be discussing things with Dr. Belina Mott and Nurali Bora. And you get more details again in your email. Make sure you will be on mute when you come into the room. This allows us to keep it so that the chatter to a minimum. You can send questions to us via the chat function. And, if you send questions ahead of time, we appreciate that. We'll do our best. We didn't get through many questions last time, so we'll see if we do a little better today. And then you can rename yourself if you are if in the participants list so that we know who you are. Although it's not necessary, but this really makes it a little bit easier for us to know who's present. This is being recorded, so, decorum, and it will be allowed. We're recording in order for people in the future to watch this who were unable to attend. We'd like to thank the Kent County Medical Foundation for their support. And I am Dr. Eric Larson. I'm the host of the Paradox Podcast, former chair of the Kent County Medical Society, or president, I should say. And again, this is a follow-up. This will be accessible on YouTube. If you want access to this episode and you want to share it with your colleagues, or you want to look at the prior one, you can go to the case. You can email us at kcmsoffice@kcms.org. Briefly, Dr. Herman Sullivan is a neurologist who works mainly at St. Mary's. He's a graduate from the University of North Carolina School of Medicine and did his residency at Case Western. Nedd is native-born islander from Grenada, who is the founder of the Infusion Associates in 2001. And then Dr. Peter Knoester is native Grand Rapidian and graduate GR Christian High, Calvin College, and University of Michigan Medical School. He's an anesthesiologist, and so I'll give him a little extra pat on the head for being a great specialist. And why don't we go ahead and get started? I'm going to change my screen so I can actually see everybody now. And I'd like to thank everyone for participating again. And once again, this is going to be a discussion on race. It's sort of free-flowing conversation. If you have questions, feel free to send them via chat to us. There will be a drawing at the end of the session today for those who are still who's still on the line at the end of our session, where we'll give some sort of door prizes. Since we can't physically be present, we can only be socially present. So we'll do our best to unsocially distance, but physically distance ourselves. So I'll start just to throw it to the 3 panelists. I guess whatever one who wants to jump in first, you're welcome to. The first question is sort of a broad one. What do you define as race? Do you think it's scientifically based? Is this, or is it a cultural phenomenon? And then how do you think ethnicity, or how would you define ethnicity with relation to race as well? Anyone can unmute and go for it.
Sure. Well, I'll take a stab at it. I mean, I can pull my phone out and give you a dictionary definition, but my personal view is that race, as we define it based on physical characteristics, is really, from my point of view, a biological construct. And to me, the biological construct is formulated by evolutionary changes. And, one of the easiest ways of delineating humans based on race is by skin color, by the amount of melanin that's in the skin. And it varies from high concentration in some Africans and to low concentrations in people in other parts of the world, in particular Europe. But from a biological construct, there's a rationale for having a lot more melanin in your skin if you're living in the Sahel or the Sahara. And it has to do with the fact that you could develop skin diseases and not survive. So there was an evolutionary reason for having melanated skins. Now when people moved out of Africa into or hominids moved out of Africa into parts of Europe, vitamin D levels plummeted. And from my point of view, one of the reasons you have less melanated individuals is because there was a need to have endogenous vitamin D levels rise. And those who began to lose some of their pigment probably had an evolutionary advantage because that was countered by the increase in the vitamin D levels, which we now know has more, not just function when it comes to strong bones, but has an immune mediated function. And people who are vitamin D deficient may be at a higher risk for having immune mediated diseases. And as someone who runs the MS clinic, I'm always monitoring vitamin D levels. Very interesting observation when it comes to MS patients over the years is that the further you move away from the equator, the higher the incidence of MS. And for a long time, we used to think that that had something to do with infections or maybe the cold weather or being enclosed during the cold weather. But come to find out, it correlates much better with vitamin D levels. The further you move away from the equator, the lower the endogenous vitamin D levels and the higher the risk of certain diseases. So from my point of view, race is an evolutionary biological construct. Ethnicity, to me, is a cultural determination. Ethnicity comes about via the human need for tribalism, to identify with people, to be able to pass on cultural memes. And I think that's where we've gotten into trouble over the years, is conflating those two things. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel pretty similar to you, Herman, that, in terms of race, it's really, based on, some physical characteristics that differentiates people. Whereas, I think ethnicity is a broader term that it is inclusive of, tribal, region of the world, language, other cultural, perspective that defines, a certain, population. And, sometimes I think, in that, the conflicting of the two sometimes merge sometimes, and sometimes they don't. Like when we talk about, things like what is Latinos versus, non-white, Hispanics, it can take you into, some overlaps and some distinction but oftentimes I think it's really the pure physical characteristics or this group of, features and group of activities like language, tribalism, that kind of stuff that, defines something within ethnicity. At the end of the day, I think the question that we really, pose to ourselves, especially in the communication that we had in our last kind of fireside chat was, at the end of the day, is those differences that seems to be, the great tragedy that we're experiencing, at least in the breakdown of societal norms that we have seen as in recent times.
And to piggyback, or to, I guess, to hone in the focus of race in the context of the United States of America, I strongly recommend everybody picking up the book Birth of a White Nation by Professor Jacqueline Betalora out of Chicago. She talks about the creation of the white race. So up until the United States, there was no white race. But from a political legislative standpoint, in order for the Eurocentric white male property owners to have a heads up in the colonies early on, they decided that they would come up with this term white to help delineate who could own property, who could vote, who could marry who, and then here we are, a few hundred years later, with all the ramifications of the creation of the white race and the creation of white as supreme or white supremacy, and how that has impacted our country on a political scale, on a health scale, on economical scale, educational scale. It was, again, the catalyst into chattel slavery, lynching, Jim Crow South, and mass incarceration, etc. There's that fine line of DNA that has been interwoven based on the creation of the quote unquote white race. But yeah, and then cultural ethnic differences, again, I agree with you guys, has more to do with groups of people living in communities, and that varies by region, etc. So, but I think, again, where we find ourselves now as a country, and with, I think, what we're trying to wrestle with, and even why we're having this fireside chat, is rooted in the false creation or the false identity of the white race.
Yes, that's interesting. Just final point there, Pete, because throughout history, what has been defined as white, I guess, in America has changed, right? I mean, I think you look at people who are from Ireland in the 1900s, they were considered black. And so it's interesting how those sort of things shift and change, which makes it makes me in some ways feel like it's not an immutable sort of characteristic of people, right? Like it is a melanin, as Herm stated to begin with. And I think, what it means to be black is probably varies from person to person. Would you think in some respects? I mean, I personally, I feel like I'm Swedish American. I don't even know what that is, sorry, Swedish Mexican, Mexican Swede. So, I mean, I feel very comfortable both in, both sorts of cultures, I guess you'd say. And I know in talking to you in your story earlier, Pete, that you sort of felt the same way, right? I mean, so you could feel at home at Grand Rapids Christian, but you can feel home elsewhere, right? And so, and in some ways you don't feel like you have maybe a place where you always feel like totally comfortable because you're sort of straddling different sort of cultures, or I guess, right? How do you sort of, rectify those sorts of, I guess in some ways I feel like races, we define it a way now, but it's hard to sort of sometimes define specifically exactly what it is now.
Right, and it's difficult, right? Because like in our history, right, as people immigrated to the US, it was not advantageous to identify as Black, but it was advantageous to identify as white. And so whether it was the Italians, folks from Ireland, our Asian American brother and sisters, I mean, when they, had to fill out that census, check that box, or go to Congress and make their argument, it was to be considered as white. And so again, so that kind of lays a framework of the setting of the foundation of this house that we've all inherited, right? Where it is more advantageous to be white in this society up until even now. And so, as a Black child being raised by white parents in a predominantly white community, but that was, becoming this, evolving like all communities, it was a challenge, and it still is a challenge to this day too. Okay, if I don't have my white adoptive parents with me, or if I don't have my white wife with me, again, it's a very different experience for me on a daily basis. And it has to be rooted in race at the end of the day. And so, again, setting this platform for why is it important? Why are we having these conversations? Because it ultimately, at the end of the day, impacts every sector of the society. And as healthcare professionals, I mean, we've now seen, if we weren't aware before COVID, now COVID has been like kind of this magnifying glass is, hey, no, there are healthcare disparities, unfortunately, along racial lines. And again, that you can follow that trail all the way back to the creation of the white race. And so, yeah, so how to navigate that as a Black man being brought into this world raised predominantly by white people. It's been, yeah, just chatting with my wife today. It's a daily grind, and carries a lot of stressors with it. So I don't know how, but Con, maybe Herm, you guys maybe can.
I agree. I think part of that historic perspective is, it's often said that the original sin was, for the U.S. of the United States was slavery. And I think I like to share, maybe a different viewpoint. I think the original sin historically in the United States was genocide. And that was, what happened to the indigenous people, who were here before. Then layered on top of that was slavery. Then laying on top of that was anti-immigration, much like what you described, Eric, about, Italians and, the Irish and so forth. But then further later than the anti-immigrant were the Mexican immigrant, because they represent something, that kind of a border issue. And, like we often talk about borders, but whether you talk about a literal wall, but, now it's no longer Mexican immigrant, it's like Mexico becomes the whole wall, and Guatemala and everything thought of that becomes the external piece. So even this, anti-immigration stuff, it has kind of evolved and laced with some of the issues that what I think Peter was alluding to, that, in some way the defining characteristic that seems to really perpetuate itself, through this historical concept, to what we have as a present day, kind of a reflection of who we are, is, emerging, are some of those gradual, pull away that, that the Irish doesn't have the same anti-immigrant sentiment that they do. And, the Italians don't have it as they used to. And to be frank, if you came from Russia or any of those places, you kind of jump in front of the line, so to speak. So, there is still the issue that if you look at the populations like the Vietnamese or, the anti-Japanese, internment camps, et cetera, that has occurred, societal, obviously there is a deep-seated issue on the basis of race, that seems to, in some way, have been, the more recent, pragmatic, stick to it kind of a defining, quality that has created the issues that we are faced with. And that's what makes it a daily grind for, most individuals who don't kind of share in that, early representation of anti-immigration.
Yeah, Peter, I think you struck on something that I'd like to go back to, and that is how some groups may have had what seemed to be at the time a similar experience to what African Americans have experienced lifelong in this country as a group. But what happens is that those groups come in, they kind of pay their dues, they fly up under the radar screen, and then they're incorporated into the American way of life. And they may not experience, and they don't experience what African Americans continue to experience. And I'll give you an example. Look at our Jewish brothers and the kind of experience they had coming into this country, brothers and sisters coming into this country. And you're right, many of them very quickly decided to, take the yarmulke off and not be so heavily identified as being Jewish. And within a generation, they changed their names. Their names became very anglicized. And they flew up under the radar screen. But when you're melanized and when you have a codification of that racism, it's unique. It's unique. And if you look at the country itself, the type of experience that even African slaves, first, second generation African slaves had, say in Louisiana, compared to the rest of the continental USA, there was a differentiation. There was a more of a blending down in Louisiana, more of an acceptance of various cultures. And but that changed certainly after Louisiana Purchase as the country solidified. And I think it solidified behind this notion that to be American, you had to be authentically white Anglo-Saxon. And if you look at all of these experiences that people have had to endure, that is the kernel. The commonality is the white Anglo-Saxon. So I'm curious as to what you think about that, whether I'm off base in looking at where the problem may exist.
I do not agree, disagree with you at all. I would go, I'd go one step further, Con, is to say the original sin of our country is the creation of white supremacy, as white as a supreme or white centeredness. Because that, again, you guys, everybody here, you know, again, panelists, folks that are tuning in, don't take my word for it. There are many amazing scholars. There are a lot of great reads out there. I think we've tossed a bunch of those out last time around. But the creation of white as supreme, or as white as a centeredness, or just the creation of whiteness, what that did was, in a way, dehumanize the rest of humanity in the US. And that is, to me, that is where we find ourselves kind of picking up the pieces now, or trying to like fix the rotten foundation. Because even whether, you know, again, just look through our media, historically, not just social media, our magazines, our TVs, our what's being represented of the Black and white experience. And then again, we can tease this out along other racial ethnic groups. But again, historically speaking, Blacks have been viewed in a negative light. Whites have been viewed in a positive light. It's just that simple. There's if you guys, Veggie Tales, I'm sure everybody's heard of Veggie Tales, maybe you haven't. But if you have a chance, check out the Holy Post. Creator of Veggie Tales does an amazing job of breaking down race in our country, and gives beautiful examples, great data that shows this pattern that has happened since the beginning of time, or I should say, since the beginning of the American experience, so to speak. Sorry, I just think I lost my mic. I'm back. So, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
All right. So, but yeah, again, I think that's what it's at the core. So now, as we're naming it, and we're taking the time to actually pause, arrest, kind of show that we care, and then now we're taking the time to listen to one another's realities and collective experiences, to the point where, okay, how can that move our hearts and our minds to change? I think that's at the end of the day. But I think naming kind of what's at the core of this is really important for how then do we go about fixing the quote unquote problem.
And I think the message here, you know, Eric, as you feel some of those questions, you know, each of us, you know, who on the panel here, you know, man of color who probably dresses up in white coats, you know, most of the day, or walk in the shadows of, you know, friends and colleagues and peers. But this experience that we are talking about is the daily grind for most of us. And that's the aspect, I think, of why a conversation like this matters, because I can almost guarantee you that for Peter and for, you know, Herm, the conversations that we're having today, you know, even though it is at the center of our lives every minute, every hour, and every day that we really perform our duties. It's invisible to everyone around us because we are defined completely by a different standard that doesn't represent who we are. And that is the isolation that exists, with this issue, of racism. And that's why I think this conversation that KCMS is finding it fit to raise, is of specific benefit to all of us in terms of the practice of the craft that we all are part of.
So for us in medicine, let's not even look at patients at this point. Let's just talk about the practice of medicine, partners and physicians, your fellow physicians. And what does success look like for, if we want to look at racial diversity? I don't know if that's the right term for it, but what do you see? What would you say is a successful outcome, or where do you think we need to work towards?
Are you referring to medical outcomes in general, or the practice of medicine in general?
No, I think the best thing to do is you clean up your own house, right? before you start trying to fix everything else. If you believe there's a problem with racism that exists within society and exists within medicine and, with other practitioners, the easiest thing to fix is obviously your own house, right? It's hard to fix everyone else. But so how would you see that? How do you see that as being accomplished within medicine? Like, for instance, how do I know that my practice is been successful in finding partners or, hiring practices or things like that? What do you think the success looks like?
Well, let me just offer this thought. I don't know that it's I think it's a different room. I think medicine is a room in a house called America. And to think that racism and some of the consequences of that can be eliminated without addressing socioeconomic issues, access to healthcare, access to insurance, which is tied to employment, and employment is the stratification of the levels of employment based upon race. All of this is interconnected, but on a day-to-day basis, I think certainly when you're seeing patients, and if you happen to be a white physician who's seeing patients of color, I think taking the extra effort to really understand the cultural phenomena that's playing into that particular illness. It's one thing to be able to say, here, take a prescription and go get it filled, but what good is that if you really have no coverage to do that? So that's what I'm saying. It's a multi-dimensional problem. And I think recognizing the fact that you may bring certain biases into favoring certain diagnoses, discounting certain diagnoses, favoring certain treatments, making assumptions about how people will respond, to certain medications. I think those are some of the immediate steps that physicians can do. I don't know if I mentioned this before. I've had residents present to me patients, and almost invariably, if it's an African-American patient, they will identify that person by the color of their skin. If it's a white patient, they never do that. And I always ask the question, well, why did you present this patient and tell me about their race, but this other patient, it seems not to matter? I mean, those are kind of the subtle things that I think can have a negative impact, because I think you're bringing, in that instance, you're obviously bringing some of your biases, and you think you're being objective, stating that there may be certain diseases or certain responses to medications based upon color of skin, but maybe not.
I also think, Herm, there are some practical things that are occurring in healthcare. The RWJ Foundation for many years have initiated some activity around social determinants of health, and one of the things that came out of it was CMS have adopted this as a payment model moving forward. Actually, the Blues, Blue Cross Blue Shield, so those of you who on the call who are associated with some of the future payment in terms of VBRs and incentive payments, Blue Cross Blue Shield is actually asking every provider to do the Stanford implicit bias test as a condition of how we would be paid in the future. And the expectation is that all providers and the leadership and the practice will have to take this and report it out. And so it's really interesting that I think and probably it's one of the history of how physicians have operated. I think to a large degree we belong to a profession where we do good and we help people and we come up in classroom and lecture halls that parades this goodness which we are part of, which we all welcome, and we certainly try our best to do it well. But if the issue of race and the issue of Jim Crowism and the issue of bias and so forth has existed in our society for a long time, the notion that the educational system that educated us in medical school and residency would be somehow free of the influence of racism would be highly unlikely. So now that we this practice in body which tends to have its identity mostly a kind of a white norm of what medicine is or ought to be, how do we in organized medicine don't fall prey to the issues that we did in other things? We when hospitals and payers and so forth were making the adjustment in healthcare, we thought we were at the pinnacle of care and didn't have to do that, and we were kind of left behind. I think the same issue is occurring here to some degree. I think we are lauding ourselves, and patting ourselves on the back that because we are in the interest of doing good, and we pay attention to the Hippocratic Oath, that in some way, in some way we are not, implicated, in this, original sin. And to some degree, I think we have to have the same commitment that other stakeholders, within the landscape of health is adopting, or else we have a second round where we may be left behind in terms of what we do.
So I agree. This is multifaceted, and every sector in life seems to intersect within healthcare, right? The how healthy we are as a country, as a nation, is evident in our exam rooms, in our ORs, in our ERs, in our delivery suites. So I agree with Herm. You can't just say, hey, how do we clean up our own house? Our own room in the house. We have to continue to learn more about the other rooms and how that's impacting the overall healthcare of not just Blacks, but also whites. So I would say a couple points. Number one, we love data. Talking to Khan a few months ago, it's when healthcare, hey, show us the data. Well, there's a lot of great data that's coming out that shows extreme healthcare disparities. Within the last 6 months, there's the data that came out that show, yeah, Black women do worse when it comes to delivery. Their maternal health, they die at a higher rate than white women. That is somewhat corrected when they have a Black physician taking care of them in the OB suites. And that's enough for, hey, we need to pause. We need to take in that data. We need to look at what are the systems that are leading up to that? Why are Black women dying at a higher rate, period, than white women? And why does it seem to make a difference when they have a person of color who's taking care of them? So I think being aware of the data that's out there and starting to look for healthcare disparity articles that are coming out in our big journals. That New England Journal of Medicine is doing a great job, at least from an editorial stance, that's starting to uncover and peel back the scab of our healthcare disparities. So I would strongly recommend following them in other journals. But I would recommend, hey, I would not be surprised if healthcare insurance agencies, CMS, et cetera, will start asking us, hey, how do quote unquote white Caucasian patients do? How do Black patients do? How do Latinx patients do? How do transgender patients do in your care? What's your practice? What's the data? Show us the numbers. And with EMR and whatnot, I think it's we can mine our own data in a way that can show us, hey, where are we doing things well and where are we doing things poorly. And then on top of that, I think implicit bias is a key piece to what we're doing. I'm sorry, can you not hear me well, Con?
I was suggesting that if you want to go to your computer audio rather than your earbuds, you may take away some of the.
Is there feedback?
I haven't noticed any, but that's fine.
No, I think it's because
He's stealing your internet
probably
probably
it.
because your neighbor, right?
Yeah,
That's my guess.
that's probably it. Yeah. So to mine further in that quality data, then there's an intersection there with our data and then our own implicit bias, and that cuts both ways. I know there's a lot of folks that are out there, crap, another hoop to jump through when it comes to what we need to do to fulfill our society's requirements and whatnot. But a perfect example. No, there's no perfect examples, but a good example is if we look at our country's history with crack cocaine versus coke, right? In the Black community, in the white communities. And there was this massive war on drugs and whatnot. And that was our launch towards dealing with crack cocaine versus the powdered white cocaine. And two very different ways that we dealt with the Black and white communities with that drug. Fast forward to now, the last 10, 15 years, we've seen a rise in opiate dependence, abuse, tolerance, et cetera, and increased death as a result to our pain meds. And this largely has become a white problem. And now we talk about this being a public health issue. And there's other data out there that's showing that Black men, women, children, Latinx men, women, children are not getting their pain treated and addressed in the same ways as white men and women and children. And so, again, as this is being brought to our light, I think there are systems issues at play. There are our own personal I have implicit bias just as much as the next man or woman. But if we don't know what we don't know, then we're going to continue to perpetuate, I think, systematic errors when it comes to taking care of our patients. And then lastly, I would say the other piece that we need to do is, educate, provide better representation of Black, Latinx physicians and nurses in our healthcare fields. I think I read the other day that there's only, I think the three of us guys on the panel only make up 5% of Black physicians are only about 5% of the collective, whereas it's 13% of we're 13% of the population. So, there's, obviously that's not going to happen overnight, but I think, there are multiple ways to look at how can we reach a larger scope of kids growing up that can say, hey, I see Dr. Nedd, I see Dr. Sullivan, I can be like them. And again, provide them healthy ways in which to do so. But again, that goes back to, again, education and the disparities in education. That goes back to food insecurity, that goes back to housing, et cetera. White flight from the core cities to the suburbs and the funding that goes with that. And so I know we weren't supposed to talk about politics, but then it gets very political. So all that to be said, there are a lot of things that we can do, but I think the first part that we're all doing right now is we're starting to become more aware of what we didn't know when it comes to disparities within our healthcare systems. So,
and frankly, as I said earlier, just having this conversation is kind of the first steps in any of these. Because, I think, historically, at least in my experience, in Grand Rapids, it was difficult to start having these conversations, for whatever the reasons, whether it's I'm uncomfortable, whatever the situation that in the past had predisposed us to this issue of continued ignorance, just because we wouldn't have this conversation. And we couldn't have it together as physicians. I mean, if you think about our profession, for almost everything that we do, it's with rigorous science, rigorous data, and sometimes, we can be brutal in terms of a rigor in which we really challenge, the data in our respective field. And, I tend to look at race and race issues in the same way. It requires this kind of vigorous discussion. It requires us to really look at data and to really, look at it openly. I think even sometimes as an African American, there has, historically been, areas where African Americans actually, in the way they practice medicine, has actually perpetuated the very same disparities that exist in race, which tells you the impact of racism is so significant in that it influences a generation of how we learn and how we, incorporate, but not just our belief, but the way we practice, and our ability to, really, do well on behalf of our patients is to also be open to that very, tough and difficult conversation. So, having this conversation or KCMS, having this, as one of the things that we want to talk about, especially in these times, I think it's very timely.
I would put forth a conjecture that we can continue to mine the data and gather the data, but I think the ore that gets mined is going to be exactly the same. I don't think we're going to find out anything different. And I think we're going to see the same thing, which is that healthcare outcomes are very much tied to your zip code and your melanin content. So I would like to throw up the white flag of futility. I think this is a futile analysis to get more and more data, which I think is going to tell us the same thing. The question that I pose is, what's the core of the problem? And from my perspective, the core of the problem is the relationship that many white Americans have with people of color and how that gets structured in our social networks. That's what I want to try to figure out. The simple question, what is wrong with white folks when it comes to people of color? And if we don't begin to address that issue, I think it's going to be futile. So I'm curious, what do you think the problem is with white folks and their relationship with people of color? And it's not necessarily limited to America. You can go down to South Africa and look at their history.
Sure. Anywhere, all sorts of places in the world, right? Can I ask you a question? I guess it sort of gets to your question. I'm the one asking the questions, right? But so when it comes to, I feel like there's somewhat of a tension, or maybe it's not tension, but there's certainly different viewpoints when it comes to race in the United States. You look at the message from Martin Luther King, and it was one of a colorblind society, one where we don't recognize race and that it doesn't exist, right? That you judge them by people by the content of their character, not by the color of skin. And I feel like that was sort of the dominant credo, I guess, back when I was a kid growing up. And that was sort of the ultimate goal, right? To not recognize, to your point earlier, Herm, that you don't mention someone's African-American or you don't mention they're white. You don't have a default patient or idea of what the person is. And then you have to basically mention a variant, right? Like someone's, elderly or they're African-American or whatever. And that there's also I think an opposing or a different sort of viewpoint to where there's an intense focus on the racial identity of people. And so what do you think, where do you think we should, where should think we should be? They seem like they're in conflict. Are they not? Is this my imagination that's not what sort of the end goal is?
Well, I'll quick jump in. I think we misinterpreted Martin Luther King Jr.'s words there. He was not perpetuating or promoting a colorblind society. He was a proponent of celebrating diversity, because ultimately we don't see color, if we don't see race, if we don't see ethnicity, culture, we don't necessarily see all of who we are. And so I'll just pump the brakes on that thought there. But yes, Eric, you're not alone. You know, my wife's family, white friends of mine growing up, they're like, oh no, I was taught that I wasn't supposed to see you. You're just Pete. You're Pete. That's it. But I, up until recently, have just said, okay, yeah, I guess I'm just Pete. I'm not the black kid. But no, I have a very different experience and reality than you do. And again, we are operating in, we keep bringing up the house analogy, but again, the house that we inherited, it's almost like we inherited two very different houses based on our races. And again, if you expand that out, it can be a beautiful thing. But I think historically, what has the problem here is that, again, the white construct was built on dehumanizing the other. We'll just call the other, the black, brown existence. And that has had very deadly consequences, that has had amazingly, historically, a huge economic influence. It's just, but it's not, I think again, we going back to Martin Luther King Jr. and his take on race, it was not, I think we miss a lot of his other teachings if we think that what he was perpetuating was a colorblind society, that was the ultimate utopia or panacea.
Well, just to pick up on that, Martin Luther King Jr. At some point bemoaned the notion of integration to some degree, because he posed the question, what in the world have I done? Have I integrated my people into a burning house? Meaning America, certainly at that time, was not ready for integration or desegregation, and that the African American was going to pay a high price for that. And I think that's what we're seeing today, a huge price for many of our institutions, which were owned to a large extent by African Americans, businesses, schools, neighborhoods, homes. So yeah, I don't think it's misconstrued. I think that was Martin Luther King Jr.'s ideal, but I think he ran into reality. Like when he was marching in Cicero, and he commented out, some of these people were worse than they were down south.
Yeah, you're right, Herman. I think sometimes, historically, I think the issue on race and the decisions or even the policies that influence race has always been made by people who weren't part of that race, right? To a large degree. And I think it happens, even today, I think, and if we were to take it into, our physician world, the decision makers, or the how we make decisions, is often an altered reality, because, our good, white fellow physicians, sometimes get, trapped in that, kind of a whirlwind of how decisions are made. Again, because we are in the business of doing good, we get wrapped up in the issue of, well, what can I do to help you? As opposed to the notion of, how how can I get other people who doesn't look like me to enjoy the same thing that I'm enjoying, so that we can really lift us all together. So I am less of the kind of a missionary minded, issue of saying, how do I help, fellow brothers and sisters, if I happen to be a white physician, how can I help my fellow, brothers of color, and what can I do for you, and that kind of stuff, as opposed to saying, no, it's the issue of, how do you make us participants just like you are, so that we can, join forces and have the same kind of influence and do the same kinds of things. And I think that's the conversation. We don't need, missionary work. We need, this idea of seeing the value of what Pete has to offer and what, Herm has to offer, and creating an atmosphere where that exchange can occur. And then other kids and other, youngsters who are coming up can aspirationally think that this is a possibility, that, some of what they have of value, they can really, through innovation, through, all the other things that young white boys and girls are exposed to, they can have that opportunity, to be, who knows, cure cancer, or add to, the veracity of scholarship that we have in medicine. So that's kind of the way we have to really look at it. If we don't see it that way, then I think from an opportunity standpoint, we are losing out on what we believe the world can be, with all the minds participating, or at best, we can be shooting ourselves in the foot, because, we are stifling our ability to grow as humanity, because we are perpetuating these ideas that are not just, historically part of who we are, but continues to today.
I mean, so in some respects, you're saying that it's not for whites to solve this problem, right? I mean, from a missionary standpoint, it's to have everyone be part of the solution, because if you were to put all the power in one person to fix it, then you've basically limited yourself to being powerless, right? And so there's definitely some interplay here. And so how do you see that sort of work together to get to the desired endpoint?
And I think actually Herm did land a little on that. I think what he was saying is that before it becomes a problem to fix, there has to be a problem to acknowledge. And I think that's probably the part that we kind of are missing that step. In actuality, as physicians, whether black or white, we are pretty good at fixing stuff. But if we don't think there is a problem in the first place, it's really hard to get started on that issue.
Yeah, and I think it goes back. Yeah, so it's awareness, right? And so historically speaking, a lot of how we've seen or operated in society has been from a predominantly white lens, and especially within healthcare, like Con was saying, it's a white lens that's looking at all these issues in healthcare, especially healthcare disparities, right? We've got this one lens. I think, to use an analogy, if the only person sitting at the table making the decisions is a white middle-aged man, we're going to miss out, right? But if you start pulling other chairs up to the table, and then you start having conversations and that having conversations with people who are actually in those different sectors in the community, like Herman was saying, in building relationships, at the end of the day, I think that's a healthier model than trying to take a step back, just with our own biases, and trying to fix a problem just on our own. But I also would too say, this isn't just people within the healthcare sector. These are the community organizers, the boots on the ground, the people working at in different clinics that aren't maybe necessarily healthcare workers. I would say even our teachers and whatnot. What are they seeing? What are they noticing with their kids and their families? What challenges are they facing? And again, making us aware of these problems, but then also being a part of those solutions to come up with a healthier model and a healthier system for healthier human beings.
Well, I would offer this thought that that I think the onus is on white America. I mean, Black America's carried this burden now for hundreds of years. And, you know, we're still carrying that burden. And the socioeconomic difference, or certainly the economic differences, are just as stark in many ways. Do you know what the average wealth of an inner city Bostonian is? The net wealth of an inner city Bostonian is about $8. You know, and that can be recreated across other areas of the country. So, you know, the notion of reparations is not such a far-fetched scheme in terms of providing a scaffolding for getting equal footing. It's just such a massive thing, I think, for white Americans to comprehend that, you know, that airplane will probably never get off the ground. But I do think the problem is the perception of white Americans in relationship to people of color. What drives the motivation to construct these social aspects that lead to these outcomes? I don't know if you know the work of Frances Kressling. She was a psychiatrist at Howard and was in Washington, D.C. for a number of years. She passed away a couple of years ago. And one theory that she had, which may have some sensibilities to this, is the notion of genetic annihilation. That if you do intermix races, you may not necessarily end up with Caucasians. And is it a primitive motivation to do this? I don't know.
Well, my Swedish relatives would definitely think so. I didn't get my dad's blonde hair, fair skin, or blue eyes. I'm going to move to Dr. Downs has a question. If you guys don't mind taking that question, go ahead, Dean.
Yes, thanks, Eric. So I kind of want to return to the question that you posed earlier, Eric. I've been involved with recruiting in this organization for a number of years, and it's hard, right? We tried to attract people of all creeds and genders. And how, Peter, I'm going to ask you in specific, how do we make our organization more attractive? I don't want to wait, like Khan's talking about, to influence young children. I want to get residents in practice attracted to our organization. And as a society, I would see that as one of our prime directives. My wife's pediatrics practice. How do we make our organizations more attractive to people of color? And then you can help us fix the foundation and interact with patients from there. I just don't even know what I don't know, Peter.
So Dean, can I just, before Peter jump in, let me just say this. You know, I've been involved in a variety of initiatives in Grand Rapids. Actually, one with Varnum, as they were, Varnum had did some work and looking at the amount of lawyers of color, who are partners in firms in the Grand Rapids area, and compared to 43 other cities of the size of Grand Rapids in the United States, Grand Rapids were 42 in ranking. And Varnum did something that was really interesting. They created an initiative around, very much how do they address this issue. And one of the things that I knew that I was in one of the original groups, it's still going on, but one of the things that were really talked about is that, you don't, the issue of recruitment is not a practice issue as much as it's a community issue. In other words, when you bring in doctors into Grand Rapids, they don't just come to be an anesthesiology in APC, they come to live in Grand Rapids and to have other professionals that are their friends, their neighbors, and so forth. So, part of that issue is the difficulty in hiring people. It's not when it's that young residents that say, oh, Atlanta, Washington, DC, Miami and Grand Rapids, where am I going? So part of that issue is really cultivating this kind of a togetherness from a professional platform in organizing ourselves to where we have a friendly environment that folks that we are bringing here can see aspirationally, I can take roots here and grow a family and feel safe and all the other things that comes with it. So I don't want to suggest to anyone here that, everything is generational. Ultimately it is a generational effect, before we get there. But our ability to do the immediate things that you're talking about, we cannot do it by ourselves. We have to do it in partnership with the other, professionals that belongs to part of our community. Go ahead, Pete.
Oh, hey, that's beautiful. Because yeah, it's not just healthcare, it's our lawyers, it's talking to Grand Rapids Christian, Grand Rapids Public Schools. They've been trying so desperately hard, that both the current superintendent at Grand Rapids Christian and the former superintendent at Grand Rapids Public Schools, trying desperately to recruit Black and brown men and women to come teach in their schools. And it's difficult. And I agree with Con. A lot of this has to do with the community itself. Now, I will say, after growing up here, right? So I grew up here. I vowed never to return, and here I am. And coming back, seeing that it's continuing to evolve and become a healthier, wholer place where not just white, quote unquote, Christian people are welcome, right? And Dean and Con and her, maybe you guys, I could be wrong, but it appears to me that medical community looks very different than it did 20 years ago. And I would say it's changed almost exponentially in its makeup in race, women, LGBTQ, other religious affiliations, et cetera, that are on a professional level within our healthcare communities. But I hear you in the urgency and wanting to do this and make this change now. But again, unfortunately, I think just looking at and doing this and other, having this conversation with other facets within the community, it's a slow burn. Unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for you to like, hey, what's the silver bullet that's gonna get a massive wave of Black and brown and folks to come here and join the professional ranks of Grand Rapids. I also, and I don't know these numbers, but I'm curious at like how many Black anesthesiology residents are there right now? How many Latinx anesthesiology residents are there right now? I don't think it's that large of a number. And like Connor's saying, like our physicians, we get diluted out, right? We go into med school, we're not all becoming anesthesiologists. And so, so that's why it's like more of a, okay, well, what can we do now? But also what can we do for kids? Because I think representation is key. It's so key because like for me, like my Black father was not a part of my life, met him several years ago, but growing up, the only Black father figures we went to a diverse church that was very diverse at the time, but otherwise it was, what did I see on TV? Who are the few other kids of colors that like Black kids, parents that I saw? Sports and music. That was it. I didn't, I'm sorry. Bill Cosby, Dr. Huxtable, like he was like the Black physician. And then after him, there was nobody until like Dr. Carson. There was no representation for me as a kid growing up. And so now we've got the three of us in this room, and I know there are other Black men and women physicians in this community that are having an impact on the next generation. And so it's a slow burn, and I wish it wasn't that way. But I think as we have a healthier, wholer understanding, and going back to what Herman was saying, like as white America sees that, yes, people of color in other walks of life are, just as capable as being solid physicians, teachers, lawyers, et cetera. They're not just, hey, you're only good at sports and all what other stereotypes that we have of the Black male. And we're gonna have to be honest, we still are wrestling with some deep-seated biases that have been handed down to us that we don't even realize, right? And so that's all a struggle. But at the end of the day, we're getting there. I have hope. I'm back here, but I think it's a slow burn.
But I'm going to go back and say we have done better, and you're right. We are more diverse, but it's an individual effort, right? It's you're my guy, Peter. We had to have women tell women that this is a safe practice, that you will be respected. You will, and we've been more successful with women than we have with minorities. And
actually,
go ahead.
Actually, Dean, that's the history of America, that, from civil rights, women has actually benefited more than, people of color, but which is a great thing because, it still adds to the diversity. One of the things, I'm going to say this because I think one of my roles, and many of you guys know that I'm a trustee for the Kellogg Foundation. And one of the things that we do at the foundation is that we look at the issue of racial equity, and we have decided that we wanted to make it part of our DNA. In other words, if you go and look at our mission, you look at what we do, it is part of our DNA. And because it's part of our DNA from the board all the way down to anybody who works there, everybody understands that. So our board, for the size of organization that we are probably, in philanthropy, we are probably the 7th largest foundation, and we are the most diverse. But from there, because it's in our DNA, everybody that we get involved with, they know, that this is what we are, and that's what we try to represent. But we go even further than that. We have in our DNA that everybody that we work with, from Bank of Mellon, it doesn't matter who that our vendors are, we don't insist that they have to have any quotas or anything like that, but we get them acquainted with what our mission is and what we believe, and we let them know that we give them an opportunity to change or to adopt, part of what we believe our feelings are on racial equity, and that's how we use as an instrument of change. By saying, if this is our mission, this is what Mr. Kellogg wanted, we're going to put it in our DNA, and it's going to be something that comes out in everything that we do, from the vendors that we have to the people that we interact with. So when you ask about, how do you do it? That's how you do it, is that if you believe that there is a real issue with racial inequities, in medicine, if you have a large enough group and you want to do something about it, it takes that level of saying, let's make it part of our DNA so that everybody everywhere knows, hey, this is who we are. And there are companies who have done it well. Salesforce have done it well. There are a lot of, large, very successful companies, I think of the top 50, United States companies, that has great success, has done it well in terms of, their commitment to diversity. So, the very same thing is in the financial world. And we just had a big project that was just launched a couple of months ago with McKinsey, which is a huge, firm out in New York City, who is leading the way in trying to figure out how do we take, of the over, $80 trillion that are, handled by money managers, less than 1% are represented, by women or people of color. So unless you are taking those kinds of steps and pulling along, others in your community that has the power structure laid there, it doesn't really happen.
Take us home, Herman, then we'll wrap up.
Well, yeah, I don't want to be the downer, Dean, but I'm not sure that it can happen overnight. I mean, this is really a reawakening, I think, for many. I came up I was born in 1959, so I was touched as a youth by the civil rights movement, and there was a certain hopefulness in our country when I was in junior high school, going into high school, and as it seemed like the work was harder than we thought it was going to be, we kind of let up on the gas pedal a bit. And I just look at that number of 5.4% of physicians in this country are Black. The number of Black male medical graduates has not changed since the early 70s. So, that growth rate is 0. And, until we move that metric, no matter how hard you try, there may just not be enough numbers, to make an obvious difference. But I don't think that's a reason to give up hope for pushing us in the right direction. Start with those young ones. Start with maybe not necessarily a first grader, but certainly someone in junior high school. In the 6th, 7th grade. That's a lot of times where the spark gets started. Don't give up on those young ones.
That's a good way to end, Herm. There's always the future, right? I want to thank everyone for our panelists for being present again today. And I would encourage you, if you did not see the first episode, to go to KCMS office at KCMS. This is why I need to have it in front of me, kcms.org. So again, that's KCMS office at kcms.org. There you can have access to the Fireside Chat. We will be having one next week. Before everyone leaves, we have to give away 3 door prizes for those of you who are present. Now, I think everyone's on the screen, and I went to a lot of effort to find a random a random name generator. So I just have to get it all ready. And I'll pick the 3 names here. So Brandon Wong.
Now you should know my wife's here too. So she's another representative here.
We only go by households, Dean. Nice trying to game the system. And I'm not intentionally picking anesthesiologists, but the next is Paul Jacklich. And third is all.
It's too uncanny. He unmasked his camera.
Okay.
And he gets the door prize.
So I'm not even on the screen, and strangely, Paul went a second time, so I have to reset again. So this is truly random.
Oh my gosh.
And Bill Bagley. So it is an anesthesia sweep.
It's door prizes, by the way.
Door prize. Yeah, you get to host the next one. No, but I want to thank everyone for being present. If you won, we'll make sure we get a hold of you. I can get a hold of all 3 of you guys. That's pretty easy. So we should be able to manage that. Please come next week. And at some point too, we'll have more. I think we'll continue doing these Fireside Chats, and maybe not as intense, but certainly different subjects. We want to try and broaden it out too. So things that are important, discussions to have within the community, the medical community anyway, and maybe the community at large too. So thanks again, everyone.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Eric.
Thank you all.
Great. Thank you
Thanks,
guys for your
everyone.
time. Appreciate it.